Listen to me carefully. In 40 years living alone in the Canadian wilderness, I filtered over 12,000 gallons of water using a method so simple that most people dismiss it immediately. 12,000 gallons. That's enough water to keep a man alive for roughly 38 years. I built my first filter in 1943 when I was barely 30 years old, and I've been refining it ever since. The difference between my water and the water everyone else was drinking? Theirs made them sick. Mine kept me alive. By 1957, I'd refined my techniques so much that I went through an entire winter without a single illness. That was the year I stopped losing men around me to dysentery and contaminated water sources. Most trappers in my region, they were boiling water. Constant boiling. Using fuel they could barely afford to waste in a Canadian winter where temperatures dropped to minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I watched my neighbor spend 6 hours a day, every single day, just keeping water at a rolling boil. His firewood consumption was triple mine. He was burning through 80 pounds of wood every single week just for water preparation. I was using charcoal filters. It was then that I understood something fundamental. The old way wasn't always the best way. It was just the most familiar way. I grew up in the 1920s in Quebec, raised by a father who believed only in boiling. That's all we did. When I was 17 years old, I made my first trip into genuine wilderness, and I watched a Métis trapper named Louis Beaumont do something that changed my entire understanding of water. He pulled out a bundle of birch charcoal wrapped in cloth, dropped it into a canvas bag filled with water, waited exactly 4 hours, and then drank directly from that water without hesitation. I said to him, I said exactly this: "That water came from a river where I saw dead animals upstream. How are you not worried?" He looked at me like I was a child and said, "Boy, the charcoal remembers what to keep and what to reject. You just have to know how to listen to it." I didn't understand him then, not really, but I watched him survive 3 winters without illness, while the rest of our camp got sick constantly. That's when I started paying attention. The second major influence came from a Cree woman named Margaret who lived 40 miles from our settlement. She taught me something that no French-Canadian trapper knew. She showed me that the quality of charcoal mattered enormously. Not all charcoal was created equal. She spent entire days explaining to me that charcoal made from hardwoods like birch, oak, and maple had different absorption rates than charcoal from softwoods. Birch charcoal, she said, absorbed bacteria at a rate of 94% when prepared correctly. Oak charcoal achieved 88%. But here's what nobody tells you. Pine charcoal only reached 56% effectiveness. I tested this myself starting in 1945. Over that entire year, I kept records, meticulous records. By 1946, I had enough data to prove she was absolutely correct. The science behind this is straightforward once you understand it. Activated charcoal works through a process called adsorption. The charcoal doesn't absorb like a sponge absorbs water. Instead, its microscopic pores, which are roughly 0.001 millimeters in diameter, create an enormous surface area. A single pound of activated charcoal contains surface area equivalent to roughly 30,000 square feet. I didn't have those exact measurements back then, but I understood the principle. Tiny pores meant massive surface for contaminants to stick to. When you pull water through charcoal, bacteria and parasites get trapped in those pores. They don't pass through. It's not magic, it's chemistry. And chemistry doesn't care whether you're in a laboratory or in the middle of a frozen forest. Now let me explain exactly what materials you need and where to find them. The first material is hardwood, specifically birch wood that's roughly 4 to 6 inches in diameter and completely dry. You can't use green wood. Green wood contains moisture that interferes with the charring process. You need wood that's been seasoned for at least 3 months. When I collected wood, I always looked for standing dead trees. These trees are still in the forest, but completely devoid of living sap. The wood is lighter than living wood, usually around 40% lighter, which means it's already lost most of its water content. I could identify a proper piece from 30 feet away by its color. Dead birch turns a silvery gray color after about 2 years of standing dead. Fresh green birch is nearly white. There's no confusion if you know what to look for. The second material is sand. not beach sand. Beach sand contains salt minerals that contaminate your filter. You need sand from riverbeds or from the base of cliffs where water has washed over stone and created fine sediment deposits over decades. This sand should be roughly 0.3 millimeters in grain size. That's small enough to trap sediment particles, but large enough to maintain water flow. When I collected sand, I would grab a handful and run it through my fingers. If it felt like powder, it was too fine. If I could clearly count individual grains, it was too coarse. The right sand had a consistency like flour, but with slightly grittier texture. The third material is gravel, specifically gravel that ranges between 6 millimeters and 12 millimeters in diameter. This creates the foundation layer that prevents finer materials from compacting into an impermeable mass. I collected this from the same riverbeds where I found sand, always from areas with strong current flow. The reason is simple. Moving water naturally sorts materials by size and weight. The best gravel was always in the outer bends of rivers where the strongest flow deposited the most uniform sizes. The fourth material is cloth. You need linen or tightly woven cotton. Modern mesh cloth works better, but in 1943, I used linen. The weave needs to have openings of roughly 0.15 millimeters. This stops the charcoal pieces from entering your water while allowing water molecules to pass. I tested 18 different cloth types over the years. Canvas that was too tightly woven actually reduced water flow by 70%. Cloth that was too loose allowed fine charcoal particles through, making the water appear gray. I found the perfect balance with standard cloth used for work shirts. The fifth material is a container. You need 2 containers, actually. The first container is where you build your filter. I used clay vessels when I could find them, but I also used hollowed birch logs sealed with pitch. The most effective container I ever built was made from stacked stone sealed with clay mud. The walls were 8 inches thick, and this container never cracked even through temperature swings of 80 degrees between day and night. The second container is where you collect the filtered water. This should be separate from the filter to prevent recontamination. The container dimensions matter significantly. My primary filter was cylindrical with a diameter of 14 inches and a height of 28 inches. These proportions were not random. This height-to-width ratio of 2:1 creates ideal flow characteristics. Water doesn't rush through or stagnate. It moves at a rate of roughly 2.4 inches per minute, which provides enough contact time with the charcoal for effective adsorption. The capacity of this container was 18 gallons. That meant I could filter the drinking water for 4 people for 5 days with a single batch. Now, I'll walk you through the exact construction process, the steps I refined over decades of constant testing and modification. The first major change in my technique came in 1949 when I discovered that pre-boiling the water to 98 degrees Celsius before filtering increased charcoal effectiveness by 32%. I documented this through winter of 1948 to 1949. I had test groups. I kept meticulous records in a leather journal that I still have today. When water enters charcoal at higher temperatures, the charcoal's pores open more readily. The chemical bonding between contaminants and the charcoal surface strengthens dramatically. This wasn't a small improvement. It was the difference between 84% contamination removal and 100% contamination removal. From that winter forward, every filter I built was always preceded by heating the water. The second major change involved the order of materials in the filter column. Everyone else I knew stacked materials in random order. I tested systematically. The correct order from top to bottom is this: cloth layer, then coarse gravel layer 2 inches thick, then fine gravel layer 3 inches thick, then sand layer 4 inches thick, then charcoal layer 8 inches thick, then sand layer 2 inches thick, then fine gravel layer 1 inch thick, then cloth layer. This specific sequence took me 18 months of testing to perfect. I built 12 different filter configurations in 1951. I ran the same contaminated water through each one exactly 50 times. The arrangement I just described produced the clearest, most contamination-free water. Every other arrangement failed at different rates. One arrangement looked clean, but still contained parasites. Another filtered out parasites, but allowed bacterial colonies to develop within 6 hours. The system I described worked every single time. The third major change was the introduction of a slow filter technique I learned from Margaret's son in 1956. Instead of pouring water rapidly through the filter, you let gravity do the work slowly. The water level in the top chamber should always remain at least 6 inches above the charcoal layer. This constant pressure creates steady flow. Water takes approximately 16 hours to move through the entire filter. That's the ideal time. Faster than 12 hours means insufficient contact time with the charcoal. Slower than 20 hours means water is stagnating. I built an overflow system to maintain consistent water level. A simple carved stick marked at the correct level checked every 4 hours. When water levels dropped below the line, I added more water from my holding tank. This sounds tedious. It wasn't. It became automatic, like breathing. The fourth element addressed the activation of the charcoal itself. Raw charcoal from wood doesn't perform like activated charcoal. You need to activate it. The traditional method is heating. But I discovered something more effective in 1952. I burned hardwood to charcoal, then soaked that charcoal in salt water for 3 days. The salt solution opens up the pores at a microscopic level. I would soak 20 pounds of charcoal in 4 gallons of concentrated salt water. The charcoal would sit for exactly 72 hours. Then I would rinse that charcoal 17 times with fresh water to remove all salt residue. Those 17 rinses were not random. I tested 15 rinses, 17 rinses, and 20 rinses. 17 rinses provided the best balance between pore activation and salt removal. Too few rinses and salt remained in the charcoal, introducing minerals into my filtered water. Too many rinses and the pore activation began reversing. The fifth element involved the collection and storage of the filtered water. This is where most people failed. They would filter water perfectly and then contaminate it through improper storage. I kept filtered water in sealed clay vessels placed in the coolest part of my shelter. Temperature mattered enormously. Water stored above 58 degrees Fahrenheit began growing bacterial colonies within 48 hours. Below 58 degrees, the same water remained clean for 17 days. I monitored temperature obsessively. My records show that I kept a fire at specific distance from my water storage to maintain consistent temperature year-round. In winter, closer to the fire. In summer, buried partially underground where earth temperature stayed at 52 degrees Fahrenheit even in July. I validated this entire system through brutal reality. The first major test came in the winter of 1953. I was 40 years old. I had been living alone for 7 years at that point. I tested my filter against water taken from 3 different sources: a stagnant pond that I knew was contaminated, a fast-moving creek that appeared clean but contained parasites, and water collected from melting snow. I filtered all 3 through my system and drank exclusively from the filtered water for an entire year. January through December 1953, I kept detailed health records: temperature, digestion, energy levels, illness frequency. I experienced 0 cases of waterborne illness. 0. In the same region, 2 other trappers who were boiling their water experienced 3 cases of dysentery and 1 case of giardia. My filter was objectively superior. I maintained these records for the entire 40 years of my wilderness living. By 1983, when I finally left the forest, I had documented 12,000 gallons of water filtered through various versions of my system. Not a single illness attributable to that water. The comparison before and after my refined filter is striking. Before 1943, I averaged 2 cases of waterborne illness per year: dysentery, giardia, and other parasitic infections. After implementing my system in 1943, that number dropped to 0. 0 cases in 40 years. That's not luck. That's engineering. The other trappers in my region averaged 417 days of illness per person across the 40-year period. I averaged exactly 8 days, and that was from injuries and cold, not contaminated water. My system worked because it was based on testing, not assumptions. In modern application, this technique is more relevant than ever. Most people assume that water from streams is safe if it comes from remote wilderness. It's not. Giardia is present in 47% of North American streams, according to recent studies. Cryptosporidium is increasingly common due to wildlife density. You cannot see these parasites, you cannot taste them. By the time you know you're infected, the parasites are already colonizing your intestines. My system catches what you cannot see. The filter captures particles down to 0.1 micrometers. That's 100 times smaller than the width of a human hair. That's the microscopic world where parasites live. The charcoal filter I developed is the foundation of modern water purification. Every commercial carbon filter you see today operates on the same principle I developed 40 years ago. The mechanisms are identical. The pore structure is identical. The adsorption process is identical. The only difference is that modern filters are made in factories with consistent specifications. Mine were made by hand with variation and imperfection, and yet they worked just as effectively because I tested them obsessively and refined them constantly. Look, I spent 40 years learning these techniques the hardest way possible, alone in the cold, making mistakes that almost cost me my life. My goal with this channel is to give you all that knowledge without you having to go through what I went through. If you want to learn more techniques like this, things that really work when you need them most, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Leave a like if this video was useful. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a situation where clean water was a matter of survival? And if you want to see another technique that saved me even more times, click on the video that will appear on screen. It's about building a long-term food storage system that can preserve meat for 8 months without salt or smoke. Remember that this channel presents fictional stories for educational purposes, with production assisted by artificial intelligence. See you next time, and stay safe out there.